Reflections on My Life, Part 1, from a Recovering Alcoholic. If you are a recovering alcoholic, then you have likely heard my story 100 times. Perhaps you've heard it 1,000 times. If you're an alcoholic who's still drinking or an addict who is still using, I hope my story finds you. Maybe you don't even realize you are an alcoholic yet. Looking back, I can see clearly that I was truly a hardcore alcoholic. Still am, but I just don't drink anymore. But for years I was, before I realized it, and then a few more years before I admitted it and began to seek help. Those years are, for the most part, lost years, wasted years. I suppose I did learn a few lessons, even from those wasted years, but for the most part they were just a repeat of the patterns of the previous years. From the outside looking in, if you could remove the hardcore alcoholism, you might look at certain aspects of my life and think, wow, what a cool and free way to live and enjoy life, travel, see the world. If you remove the drinking from my life, perhaps that could have been true. Back then I worked as a chef or a dining room server or a manager of some kind for seasonal resorts. I did this for the most part for about 20 years. This means I was often working in one resort in the winter and another resort, often in a completely different part of the country, in the summer because they were seasonal resorts. Many were only open one season out of the year. And I only worked for resorts that provided housing for their seasonal workers. All I had to do was get myself there, and I was set for the next 4 to 6 months with a roof over my head, 3 meals a day, money in my pocket. Shallow person that I was for so many years, just living from one moment to the next. That might sound like a great life to some. But when you add in the booze, it becomes a recipe for a downward spiral into extreme loneliness, an embarrassing and humiliating path of destruction left in my wake wherever I went. From place to place, I left behind broken-hearted girlfriends, angry employers that felt as if they had been completely duped by the sober version of me that could be charming. I did not look like a drunk on the outside, nor would you ever guess I was drunk if you met me sober. I was a drunk, if you met me sober. I was a clean-cut, good-looking guy. Well, women liked me. My co-workers loved me initially because I was great at ingratiating myself with a new circle of workmates and acquaintances. You might even say I was popular for a while at each new destination. But it never lasted. By the time I was moving on from one place to the next, I often did not make it through the entire season, by the way, I really had no choice but to leave at that point. Because by that time, I had burned every bridge and destroyed the trust of every person who knew me at whatever my current location was. So I would again find myself a job at another resort far away where I could try to start again with a clean slate. I could lie my way into that next job, start again fresh, pretend that what I had just left behind had never happened. I kept telling myself I would not do it again as I made my way to my new location, and I would arrive as my sober and charming self. Sometimes I would manage not to drink for a while. I was very skilled at my work and always eager to learn from those I worked with to become even better in the hospitality profession, in all aspects of it. So despite no formal culinary training, I was often employed as the chef, or the sous chef, or the kitchen manager, or even the dining room manager, bar manager, server. One time I even managed to get myself promoted to the food and beverage director of a very high-end golf resort and country club. Once again, though, my drinking always would begin to take over and destroy everything I might have built. At the golf resort where I had quickly managed to become the food and beverage director, I remember that first I let myself slip and start having just a few beers with my coworkers after we were finished working for the day. But it was not long before I had a bottle of vodka and or whiskey in my bedroom with me again. As the food and beverage director of that resort, I had keys to everything. When I was out of alcohol, I could easily let myself into the resort's liquor storage and appropriate whatever I felt needed or wanted or could get away with taking that might not be noticed. Often, I would sneak off while working to take shots in the bathroom, get myself feeling functional again, when I began to feel the shakes and the nausea coming on. Every recovering alcoholic knows exactly what I'm talking about. That last 10 years, when I was not in the brief sober phases after arriving to a new resort job, I was drinking a minimum of a fifth of hard alcohol per day, often as much as 2/5, sometimes even more than that. Towards the end, I would go to the liquor store and literally buy gallons of hard liquor, lock the door to my apartment or motel room or wherever I was living, and not come out for weeks. When I finally did come out, it was only because paramedics had arrived or the police had arrived and then called the paramedics after discovering me unresponsive when they were sent to my home to do a wellness check by someone who knew me and apparently knew enough about me to be worried. From there, I'd be transported to the nearest emergency room to be medically detoxed. I was often suicidal. I was sometimes put in the ICU on suicide watch. It is truly amazing that I'm still alive. I often wonder why. Many people die from alcohol who never drank to the level that I did. I have completely lost count of the number of times I have had to be medically detoxed. I've lost count of the times I have laid in a hospital bed shaking and nauseous, praying that they would give me something to knock me out or that I could fall asleep and never wake up. Today I've been sober for about 5 years. I got married. I have a 4-year-old son. My life seems to get a little better each day. But how did I get sober? How did I get from that guy shaking in the hospital bed, praying to be knocked out by some drug or to just die? In many stories like this, if you've read them in the past, this is the part where the storyteller will usually say he found Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA. While I did find AA at one point, AA was not ultimately what led me to getting sober and staying sober. That said, please understand that I have deep respect for AA. If you have not read the Big Book, as those associated with Alcoholics Anonymous like to call it, that it's a blue book, Alcoholics Anonymous, it says on it, I highly recommend that you do read it. Whether you're an alcoholic or an addict, or even if you have never touched a drink or drug in your life. That book was the beginning of my recovery, though it was not until years later that I actually began a successful recovery. I found that book one day after my drinking had finally put me on the streets of Fort Worth, Texas. I was homeless. I had drank myself onto the streets, literally. A sheriff's deputy had showed up to the home that I was locked inside at the time, the home I was being evicted from for not paying my rent. He loaded my completely drunk and out of it butt into his car, and apparently he just dropped me off on some grass spot behind some random convenience store. Next thing I remember is waking up to 2 different police officers standing over me. The owner of the convenience store had called the police after I'd been passed out there for a few hours, or I don't know how long. Could have been an hour, could have been 12 hours. Those 2 police officers took me to an emergency room and got me admitted once again for a medical alcohol detox. A few days later, I was discharged onto the streets of Fort Worth, Texas. I still had a little bit of money in my pocket, and I went straight as an arrow to the first liquor store I could find and bought a fifth of vodka. Maybe 2/5, I can't remember now. And then I walked until I found a house that nobody was living in. I managed to get myself inside the locked fence and then found a way into the house somehow. Can't remember exactly how I got in there either. I remember sitting down in the kitchen and I began drinking again. Next thing I remember is the police standing over me once more. This time the owner of the empty house had found me and called the cops. One of those 2 cops, who seemed to be in the leadership role, the one in charge, then said to me, Mr. Wood, you have 2 choices. 1, we take you to jail right now for breaking and entering, or 2, we can drop you off in the homeless area where all the shelters are. Needless to say, I chose the latter. I thank God now that they gave me the choice, because had they taken me to jail, I would likely have a felony on my record now. Anyway, thus began my first experience as a homeless person. It would not be my last. But it was at that time in my life that I found a copy of the Big Book. Now, if nothing else, I've always been a survivor. Although I had never been homeless on the streets before, and I was completely terrified, to say the least. I somehow managed to, with the help of a few nice fellow homeless individuals, figure out how to work the system in Fort Worth, Texas that they had in place at the time for the many, many homeless people. I usually managed to sleep inside a shelter at night, and I had 3 meals a day and a shower most days. Still, it is amazing that nothing really bad happened to me. At that time, that area was rated as one of the most violent and crime-filled places to be living as a homeless person in all of the USA. Miraculously, I was not one of the many that end up murdered there. That said, I had a lot of free time on my hands. Somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, I found a copy of the Alcoholics Anonymous book, and started reading. I was quickly drawn in. I read it cover to cover in a couple of days, and then I reread several portions many times afterwards. I realized that from reading that book that there are thousands of people out there that went through or are currently going through the same process that I was going through, and that they are at all levels of society. The man that wrote the big book was a successful Wall Street businessman, and the person he created AA with was also a chronic alcoholic. He was a doctor. He is known affectionately by Alcoholics in Recovery as Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob had basically lived the exact version of my life so far that I'd lived so far, but you could just transpose it over to the medical field instead of the seasonal resort industry. Alcoholism and addiction know no boundaries. They do not care who you are, how smart you are, or what your profession is, or how famous you might be, or how much money you might have. If anything, wealth can just speed up the process, as the alcoholic or addict has the resources to fuel their addiction at an almost unrestricted pace. When most people think of an alcoholic, their mind pictures the bum passed out under the overpass with an empty bottle and a paper sack next to him. In truth, I have been that person. More than once, I was that person, and thousands of people have certainly driven by and seen me there, of course, with not a clue who I was, or where I came from, or where I was going, and then quickly forgot about all about what they saw, because in many cities you see that multiple times per day as you drive from place to place. But for every homeless drunk that you might see on your morning commute, there are 100 smart professionals, some very wealthy, some very famous, that are just as much a chronic alcoholic or addict. One man who tells a story in the AA Big Book was a genius nuclear scientist, for example. These persons are truly completely different people when they're sober, and they're transformed into another person entirely when they drink, or, in the case of the addict, use whatever drug they're addicted to. It is truly a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of situation. They go from being a respectable, even nice person, and become a monster of sorts when they drink or use. Anyway, while the Big Book and AA were not ultimately what enabled me to get sober, and to stay sober, I do credit them with putting me onto the path. It was at that point in my life that I admitted to myself that I was a chronic alcoholic, and that if I did not find a way to stop, I was going to end up dead in the very near future. Also, I do believe that for 99% of alcoholics in the world, that AA is your best chance of getting sober, second only to your being willing to devote your life to the specific faith that I now adhere to. But my faith is a matter I do not put out into the commercial world and would never discuss here. My attempts to get sober never succeeded for longer than a few months until I found, or rather returned to, what I should have never walked away from in the first place. I would like to say more about that, but this is not the time or place. I only share that part of my life in private conversations. Thankfully, though, I did manage to find sobriety. And to back up a little bit, barring finding the faith that I return to, AA is probably your best chance of getting sober. They've gotten more people sober than any other medium that's ever been devised that I know of. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, thankfully, though, I did manage to finally find sobriety. And since doing so, you know what? My life gets better each day. Now I can look back and see every stage of my life for what it truly was, and in a completely new light. Hindsight, well, it really can be 2020. For example, early in my drinking career, I thought I was somehow gifted with a superpower. I could drink 2 or 3 times what any of my friends could drink, and though I was also very drunk, technically, chemically, drunker than they were, I could function as if I were not drunk at all. If you did not smell alcohol on my breath, then you would have no reason to think that I had taken a single drink. In fact, I was often the person driving all of my drunk friends home. They were stumbling and slurring their words and just, visibly intoxicated to anyone who might be observing them. If for some reason we did get pulled over by the police when I was driving them home, and I had always drank as much or more than them, don't forget that, I would just explain to the officer that I was the designated driver. I would lie and say I had nothing to drink that night. All of my passengers had drank very heavily, and whatever he'd observed that caused him to pull me over was the fault of something that one of my drunk friends had done to distract me for a moment. And that if he thought he smelled alcohol, it was because everyone else in the vehicle had drank a lot of it. And it worked. I even passed the field sobriety tests. It was not until many years later that I got my first of 2 DUIs. The point is that at the time, I was very proud of this superpower. I thought that I was somehow superior to most people. I thought I must have a more powerful brain than other people. Mind over matter, I would tell my friends. I tell them, if you don't want to act and look drunk, just tell yourself that you are not drunk. Use your mind to take control. Concentrate when you speak, enunciate your words, walk in a straight line. Think about your normal, sober self and become that person again when you need to. Now, however, I know the truth. It is not a superpower at all. It is actually a sign that you have the alcoholic gene or chromosome or whatever it is. While not all alcoholics have this ability in the early stages of their drinking career, when you read a lot of alcoholic stories and study a lot of the information that's now available on the study of alcoholism, you will find that this ability is a very common denominator in many alcoholics before they, became and knew they were actually alcoholics. So if you're a younger person now who is amazed at your ability to drink and maintain control of yourself, and proud of that, I urge you to please listen to my warning. This is only a temporary superpower. It will not last. I was able to be a heavy drinker for years with very little in the way of any visible consequences. I had fun. I got drunk 4 to 6 nights a week for years. I laughingly called myself a functioning alcoholic. It is not the same with everyone, but there is a progression of stages from the heavy drinker stage up to the chronic alcoholic stage. Doctors and scientists don't understand why, but with one person, the entire cycle can be completed within 2 or 3 years, and with another person, it might take 10 to 15 years or more. But if you continue to consume alcohol at that level, it is inevitable that you will eventually become the full-blown chronic alcoholic. It is just chemically impossible for you not to become so. And we will delve deeper into what it means to be a chronic alcoholic in a future article. But in short, it means that if you do not stop drinking completely, that it will kill you at some point in some way. Once you reach that tipping point, you can no longer continue to partake in any alcohol at all. You cannot go from that stage back to becoming a moderate alcohol drinker again, like maybe you were in the beginning of it all. Like my parents, who enjoy an occasional beer or two or a margarita when they go out for Mexican food. Once you reach the chronic level, you have 2 choices and 2 choices only. You either stop drinking entirely and live a life of complete alcohol abstinence, or you die. That is it. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. Keep drinking, you die. Stop drinking, you live. But not only will you just live, as in continue to breathe. But in time, you will start to learn what it really means to truly live. Not drinking at first may seem like the biggest fear you can imagine. I was terrified of life without alcohol. It seemed impossible to do it. I couldn't imagine it. But one mantra of AA that I love is one day at a time. It is true, it seems like it should be too simple, but it really is deceptively powerful. Don't even allow yourself to dwell on the notion of never drinking again ever, or never using your drug again ever. Just be determined that you are not going to drink today. You're not going to use today. Don't think about tomorrow. I'm not going to drink today. I'm going to make it 24 hours. By this time tomorrow, I will not have drank any alcohol. And if you can humble yourself to seek help, because it's not possible to get sober by yourself. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's true. It's not possible to get sober by yourself and to successfully. You just have to, as I said before, concentrate. I'm going to successfully not drink today. And if I can do that today, then you can do it again tomorrow. Before you know it, a month will have passed. And just wake up then and think to yourself again, I just have to get through today without drinking. I am not going to drink today. Then, very soon, you're going to wake up again. It will have been a year. All of a sudden, you'll wake up, and it will be 5 years later. The air will smell fresher. Your morning coffee or tea or juice or glass of water or whatever you have will be sweeter. Your food will be tasting better. The roof over your head will be a little bit nicer. Your sleep will be deeper. And your day will be so much nicer. Maybe you will have found love again. If not, you will. It is just a matter of time when you stay sober. You can get everything back that you lost and more if you just wake up each day and say, I'm not going to drink today, one day at a time.